Richard Baker thought he was in control, mocking the plumber with condescending remarks and insults. But he didn't know the man he belittled was actually the owner of the house he rented. When George returned, it wasn't with tools. It was with the truth, and a reckoning that would change everything. The morning was crisp as George Smith, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his mid-40s, parked his modest pickup truck in front of a modest single-story rental property he owned. Dressed in a pair of faded jeans, a simple work shirt, and steel-toed boots, George had taken great care to blend into the role of a plumber. His usual polished appearance, custom suits, designer watches, and a confident stride was replaced with an unassuming, low-profile demeanor. George's intent was simple: to see the house and the new tenant without the filters that typically come with being recognized as the owner. Carrying a well-worn toolbox that he'd borrowed from his brother-in-law, he walked up to the door with a quiet confidence that belied his real identity. A self-made entrepreneur with a portfolio of rental properties, several businesses, and an MBA to his name. Inside the house, Richard Baker, the new tenant, was pacing impatiently. He was a man in his early 50s with thinning hair combed neatly over his scalp and a beer gut barely concealed under an ill-fitting polo shirt. He was nursing a coffee mug while scrolling on his phone, his face creased with annoyance. Richard was used to barking orders in his line of work as a mid-level corporate manager and carried an air of entitlement that had grown unchecked over the years. He'd been grumbling to himself about the nerve of landlords sending repairmen instead of doing things themselves when George knocked. Richard opened the door with a sharp tug, his eyes immediately narrowing as he took in George's appearance. Without so much as a hello, his gaze dropped to the toolbox and then to George's hands, calloused but steady. The dismissive look on his face told George everything he needed to know. "You must be the plumber," Richard said, the faintest sneer curling his lips. "About time. The toilet's a disaster. Get to it. It's down the hall." George, unperturbed, nodded and introduced himself simply as George. "Just here to check out a few things," he said, his voice calm and measured. He stepped inside, taking in the state of the house. The floors were unkempt, with scuff marks and stains that hinted at neglect. The furniture, clearly Richard's, was mismatched and haphazardly arranged, and the faint smell of stale beer lingered in the air. As George made his way to the bathroom, Richard followed closely, continuing to speak as if George weren't there to listen. "I don't understand why these places are always in such bad shape," Richard complained, gesturing around dismissively. "Landlords cut corners, then expect people like me to put up with it. At least you're here now. Start with the toilet. I've got standards, you know." George silently knelt by the toilet, slipping on gloves and examining the porcelain. It was clean enough, certainly not the disaster Richard had claimed, but George decided to stay in character, running through the motions of tightening bolts and scrubbing surfaces. As he worked, Richard leaned casually against the doorframe, sipping his coffee and letting his prejudice flow unchecked. "Funny, isn't it?" Richard mused, smirking. "How some people just seem meant for certain jobs. I mean, it's all about knowing your place in life. You seem good at this kind of thing. I imagine it's been a steady gig for you." George paused, glancing briefly over his shoulder, but said nothing. His calm expression didn't betray the spark of indignation rising within him. He simply resumed his work, meticulously taking notes in his mind about the house's condition and Richard's behavior. Richard, emboldened by George's silence, continued. "People don't value hard work anymore. I always say, if you've got the skills, stick with them. None of this trying to climb the ladder stuff. A lot of people don't realize when they're already at their ceiling." George finished his task, stood, and turned to face Richard fully for the first time. His eyes were steady, unreadable, but his stature alone commanded a certain respect, even if Richard was too blind to see it. "Toilet's all set," George said simply. "Anything else you need?" "Yeah," Richard said dismissively, already turning back toward the kitchen. "The kitchen sink's got a drip. Handle that before you go, would you?" As George followed, he let the words roll over him, cataloging each slight, each layer of condescension. He had heard it all before, but he wasn't here to argue. Not yet. Richard kept talking as George checked the faucet, offering his unsolicited opinions about landlords, blue-collar workers, and his own supposed work ethic. People these days don't want to put in the effort. They just want handouts. No accountability, Richard said, oblivious to the irony as George quietly tightened a loose valve. When George finally packed up his tools, Richard barely glanced up from his phone. "Good work," he said, tossing the words out as if doing George a favor. "I'll call the landlord if anything else comes up. Guess I'll see you around." George smiled faintly as he headed for the door. "You just might," he said, his tone even, but with a subtle weight Richard didn't notice. As George walked to his truck, he couldn't help but shake his head, marveling at the layers of arrogance and ignorance he'd just witnessed. But instead of anger, he felt a quiet resolve. He had a better understanding now, not just of the house's condition, but of the man living in it. And soon enough, Richard Baker would have a reckoning. As the hour progressed, Richard's behavior became increasingly unbearable. He hovered over George as he worked, scrutinizing every move with unnecessary criticism. "Are you sure that's tight enough? Looks like it's still leaking," he said, even as George calmly finished tightening a pipe. "Honestly, I thought plumbers were supposed to be professionals." George maintained his composure, methodically completing each task while silently observing Richard's escalating condescension. Richard seemed to revel in his perceived superiority, offering unsolicited advice on how to do the job right. "You're lucky to have a steady job like this," he remarked with a smirk. "Not everyone can handle hard work. It's honest labor, though. Keeps things simple." George let the comment slide, his calm demeanor masking his irritation. He redirected the conversation with subtle questions about the house. "Have you been happy with the place? Everything up to standard?" Richard bristled. "Why are you asking that? You're here to fix things, not ask questions." George simply nodded, inspecting the peeling paint on the walls and the worn flooring. "Just curious. Seems like it could use a little attention." Richard's defensiveness turned into a rant. "The landlord doesn't care. Why should I? This place isn't exactly luxury living, you know. I've been meaning to send in maintenance requests, but I'm a busy man. Not everyone has time to sit around doing nothing." The conversation grew even more uncomfortable as Richard began making racially charged remarks. "You know, people like you are naturally good at this kind of thing," he said casually, assuming his comments wouldn't be challenged. "It's just in the skill set, built for it." George paused, gripping his wrench tightly for a moment before releasing it. His silence seemed to unsettle Richard, who shifted awkwardly as George finished up without a word. When George finally packed up his tools, Richard leaned against the doorframe, waving him off dismissively. "Well, you're done, right? Thanks or whatever. People like you should stick to what you're good at." George turned back to face him, his expression calm but firm. "I'll be back to discuss a few things," he said evenly. Richard frowned, confused by the cryptic remark, but said nothing as George walked out the door. As George climbed into his truck, he took a moment to reflect on the encounter. He'd seen enough: the neglected property, the missed rent payments, and Richard's arrogant, dismissive attitude. This wasn't just about the house anymore. George had work to do, and Richard was about to face a reality check he wouldn't soon forget. The following day, Richard receives a notice to attend a meeting at the house. Thinking it's a standard inspection, he assumes it's an opportunity to voice complaints about the property. When George arrives, he's no longer in work clothes but a tailored suit, carrying documents. Richard initially doesn't recognize him, greeting him with a smug expression and dismissive comments about landlords not caring about their properties. But as George introduces himself as the owner of the house, Richard's confidence evaporates. George proceeds to detail the violations of the lease agreement, delinquent payments, damages, and Richard's lack of respect for the property. He also confronts Richard about his behavior during their first meeting, stating, "I wanted to see firsthand how you treat people you think are beneath you." Richard tries to defend himself, stammering excuses, but George cuts him off. "This house is my investment, my legacy," George says firmly. "You clearly don't respect it, or the people who maintain it." George gives Richard an ultimatum: rectify the damages and pay the overdue rent within 30 days or face eviction. Embarrassed and panicked, Richard tries to appeal to George's sympathy, but George remains resolute. As he leaves, George says, "This is your chance to show me you're more than what you've proven so far." Over the next few weeks, Richard begins making amends. The experience humbles him, forcing him to confront his biases and behavior. Though progress is slow, he starts treating the maintenance staff and neighbors with newfound respect. Meanwhile, George continues to visit the property, not as a landlord, but as a reminder that change is possible when accountability is enforced. The story concludes with George reflecting on the importance of dignity, fairness, and standing up to prejudice, while Richard begins to rebuild his character, showing that even the most deeply rooted biases can be challenged through moments of reckoning.